What if the United States is no longer Canada's most important trade partner? What if that title is quietly being handed over to the European Union? While headlines argue over China and the Middle East, a different power shift is happening, one that could reshape the future of North America. And it's happening faster than you think. Welcome to Geo Capitalist, where we decode global wealth one power shift at a time. Today, we're peeling back the layers to reveal how Canada is replacing U.S. trade with the EU. Faster than you think. If you care about trade, influence, and the future of global alliances, this is the video you can't afford to miss. Subscribe to the channel, and let's dive in. For over a century, the U.S. was Canada's undisputed economic lifeline. But 2025 changed that. According to Canada's latest trade data, exports to the U.S. dropped by 6.6% in a single month. Meanwhile, exports to the EU jumped by over 24%. This isn't a statistical fluke. It's part of a larger, systemic shift. Why? In short, tariffs, uncertainty, and a deepening trust gap. As the U.S. returns to protectionist policies, raising tariffs on steel, aluminum, and even Canadian dairy, Canada is no longer waiting around. It's not just buying local, it's selling global. That's why we're seeing an accelerated pivot toward Europe, a pivot that is both intentional and irreversible. Beneath the headlines, Canadian businesses are quietly shifting logistics routes, rewriting supplier contracts, and even adjusting product certifications to meet EU standards. Rail ports in Montreal and Halifax are expanding capacity for transatlantic freight. The Canadian dollar, once tethered tightly to U.S. market sentiment, is showing increased sensitivity to European economic indicators. Even Canada's infrastructure policy is adjusting. In March 2025, the government fast-tracked a $2.1 billion expansion of Eastern trade corridors, explicitly citing EU logistics competitiveness as a strategic rationale. This is not just about economics, it's about sovereignty. When trade becomes a tool of pressure, nations look for alternatives, and Canada is finding them across the Atlantic. While the U.S. renegotiated NAFTA into the more rigid USMCA, Canada quietly signed a deal that changed everything. CEDA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union. It eliminated 98% of tariffs and opened up access to 510 million EU consumers. Trade between Canada and Europe surged from $46 billion in 2016 to over $75 billion by 2024. But in 2025, that growth exploded. Key exports like critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, grain, and tech components are now being routed through EU ports rather than across the U.S. border. And Canada isn't just exporting products, it's importing trust. Unlike the US, the EU is offering predictable regulatory alignment, green industrial cooperation, and long-term economic planning. Canada took the offer and didn't look back. Behind the scenes, European governments are actively courting Canadian firms. Germany's Handelskammer opened 2 new offices in Ontario and British Columbia. France's EDF and Total Energies have signed renewable energy MOUs with Canadian provinces, bypassing U.S. intermediaries entirely, and the Netherlands has invited Canadian agri-tech companies to pilot greenhouse solutions under joint subsidy programs. Legal frameworks have followed. Canadian courts now recognize CE marking, which reduces export compliance time by up to 40%. Canada's own ESG rules are increasingly modeled after Brussels' taxonomy, enabling faster capital flows between green funds and Canadian ventures. CEDA didn't just open doors, it shifted gravity. While U.S. trade deals focus on extraction and enforcement, CEDA was framed around partnership. And that single difference, trust over terms, is redrawing Canada's global orientation. On the surface, the U.S. and Canada still shake hands, but behind the scenes, it's cold. Very cold. When Washington demanded steep tariffs earlier this year, up to 35% on Canadian steel and EV batteries, Canada's leaders had enough. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly openly declared that Canada must diversify its security and economic partners. And that wasn't just rhetoric. Days later, Ottawa blocked a proposed U.S. tech acquisition. Weeks later, trade ministers flew to Brussels, not Washington. It's becoming clear. Canada no longer views the U.S. as a reliable long-term partner. And as Canadian public opinion shifts with it, businesses are quietly retooling their supply chains toward Europe and even Asia. What used to be seen as occasional friction is now an ideological divide. U.S. politics have turned increasingly inward and unpredictable, while Canada has embraced multilateralism and long-range stability. When the U.S. delayed crucial supply chain negotiations last quarter, citing domestic legislative conflicts, Canadian officials moved ahead with a 10-year EU industrial cooperation plan. It was a clear message. Ottawa is done waiting. Behind the scenes, leaked diplomatic memos revealed growing frustration among Canadian officials. One senior advisor described Washington's trade posture as transactional to the point of dysfunction. Another warned, "We've entered a phase where every handshake feels like a test." This isn't just about steel or dairy, it's about worldview. Canada wants climate-linked trade, stable institutions, and transparent policy. The U.S., increasingly shaped by electoral cycles and populist pressure, is offering short-term deals with strings attached. For a G7 nation like Canada, that's not good enough. So, while the headlines say allies, the back channels say split. And in global trade, trust, not treaties, is what really moves billions. This isn't just a policy shift, it's industrial, and it's accelerating. Canada has quietly become one of the top Western suppliers of critical minerals like nickel, cobalt, and lithium, all essential for Europe's EV transition. In 2025 alone, Canadian lithium exports to Germany rose 42%, and experts at the Fraunhofer Institute predict that figure could double again by 2027. Why? Because Europe no longer trusts China or the U.S. to be reliable suppliers, and Canada offers both stability and sustainability. Quebec's tech manufacturers are rapidly expanding their supply of semiconductor components to French and Dutch firms. In fact, new joint ventures between Canadian startups and EU companies are being fast-tracked under CEDA's investment protections. This gives European buyers alternatives to Taiwanese and American fabs, at a time when chip sovereignty is a top geopolitical priority. Meanwhile, Western Canada's grain trade with Europe, particularly with Spain, Italy, and Poland, has more than doubled. With climate shocks affecting other regions, Canadian wheat and barley are gaining value for their reliability and environmental certifications, which are favored by EU importers. Even Alberta's oil, long criticized for its carbon intensity, is getting a second life in Europe. Ports like Rotterdam and Antwerp are now receiving upgraded Canadian crude, reprocessed through cleaner methods, and aligned with EU green tech mandates. And the innovation doesn't stop there. Canadian biotech firms are now exporting pharmaceutical compounds to EU labs, while Canadian AI startups are getting EU grants for ethical development aligned with GDPR standards. What we're seeing isn't just a trade shift. It's a reconfiguration of supply chains, industrial planning, and even national strategy. Canada isn't waiting for Washington's next move, it's already moving east. The economic shift has a strategic twin: defense cooperation. And in 2025, that cooperation took a historic leap. In June, Canada and the European Union signed a landmark security pact, something no other country in the Americas has ever done. This agreement goes far beyond symbolic gestures. It includes concrete cooperation in cybersecurity, space strategy, collaborative military technology programs, and perhaps most importantly, access to the EU's $150 billion Safe Defense Procurement Fund. For context, SAFE, short for Strategic Autonomy and Freedom Enhancement, is the EU's post-Ukraine response to global uncertainty. It aims to reduce dependence on NATO while accelerating Europe's own defense manufacturing. By allowing Canada in, the EU is essentially extending its strategic perimeter across the Atlantic. Canadian defense firms are already submitting bids for joint drone production contracts with French and Finnish firms. Aerospace alliances are forming between companies in Montreal and Toulouse. At the intelligence level, Canada is quietly integrating into European systems. While it remains a member of the Five Eyes alliance with the US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, Ottawa is now prioritizing European data flows through cross-border cyber initiatives. Prime Minister Mark Carney made it clear Canada is committed to defense collaboration beyond the traditional North American model. His administration has increased defense spending to 2.2% of GDP, meeting NATO targets but reallocating contracts toward European partners. And a joint Canadian-EU satellite program announced in October will provide real-time climate and maritime intelligence to both parties, bypassing U.S. networks altogether. This is not a temporary partnership. It's a structural pivot, and it mirrors a global trend. Like Japan and South Korea deepening ties with Europe, Canada is diversifying for an era where U.S. security guarantees are no longer taken for granted. This shift isn't just symbolic, it's strategic. The U.S. is losing more than a trading partner. It's losing leverage. For decades, American ports, infrastructure, and policy dictated the flow of Canadian goods. But now, Canadian exports are bypassing that system entirely. EV components once destined for Detroit are being rerouted to Germany. Quebec software firms are skipping Silicon Valley, choosing Paris. Alberta oil, heading to European ports like Rotterdam. The shift is structural and permanent. U.S. automakers, struggling with labor costs and reindustrialization pressure, are watching vital Canadian suppliers shift contracts overseas. Energy firms face bidding wars with European buyers. And in tech, Canada's innovation hubs are forming joint ventures with Scandinavian, French, and even Estonian firms, leapfrogging Silicon Valley's ecosystem. That talent migration matters. Canadian AI and clean energy startups, once eager to cross south, are instead heading east. It's not just about economics, it's about trust. Years of tariff threats, Buy American policies and erratic trade negotiations have chipped away at Canada's confidence in the U.S. as a stable partner. In response, Canada is insulating itself, diversifying routes, reducing U.S. dependence, and building resilience. Washington's political volatility hasn't helped. Trade unpredictability and domestic polarization have pushed Canadian businesses to seek regulatory clarity and long-term certainty abroad. And as Canada strengthens ties with the EU, it sets a precedent. Even America's closest allies are hedging. Not out of spite, but out of strategic necessity. In a world tilting toward multipolarity, loyalty is no longer automatic. It's earned. It may sound like a geopolitical stretch, but data tells a different story. In 2025, nearly half of Canadians said they'd support exploring future EU membership, up 14 points in just 2 years. And while Canada isn't a formal candidate, its economic, regulatory, and strategic alignment is deepening rapidly. Canada already mirrors many EU policies. It uses GDPR-like data protection standards, aligns with EU carbon pricing, and follows compatible financial disclosure laws. Its trade, defense, and climate goals are increasingly shaped by Brussels, not Washington. European leaders now refer to Canada as their North Atlantic anchor, seeing it as a cultural and political bridge between continents. What some experts call soft entry is underway. Canada participates in EU defense forums, climate talks, and even digital infrastructure debates. While joining the EU outright might be politically complex, a semi-formal integration isn't out of the question, especially if U.S. protectionism continues. The groundwork is being laid, quietly, systematically. And if the U.S. keeps turning inward, Europe may not just be Canada's trading partner, it could become its institutional home. The big story isn't that Canada might pivot, it already has. The numbers, treaties, and trade flows speak for themselves. In 2025, Canada's exports to the EU outpaced growth to the U.S. for the first time in history. Defense cooperation, once unthinkable outside of NORAD and NATO, is now happening directly between Ottawa and Brussels. Canada is no longer betting on North America alone. It's diversifying across the Atlantic. This isn't abandonment, it's evolution. Canada still shares culture, history, and proximity with the U.S. But in a world defined by digital borders, energy politics, and supply chain fragility, geography matters less than stability. And right now, Europe is offering something the U.S. isn't: long-term, strategic alignment. Canada's pivot sends a message to the rest of the world. Even the most trusted allies are seeking new options. Countries like Australia, Japan, and Mexico are watching, and they may follow. The global order is not collapsing, it's reorganizing around trade, defense, climate, and data. And Canada, long seen as a quiet middle power, is now writing a bold new chapter, not just for itself, but for every country deciding who to trust next. If you found this breakdown valuable, watch our next video. It connects directly to what's unfolding. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us decode these global shifts without compromise. Let us know in the comments. Is Canada leading the next trade revolution, or simply protecting itself? Either way, the balance of power is shifting. This was How Canada is Replacing the U.S. Trade with the EU Faster Than You Think. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.